Karel Velle és flamenc, és arxiver general del Regne de Bèlgica, director general dels Arxius Generals del Regne i de l'Arxiu de l'Estat a les províncies. Com bé sabeu, a Bèlgica hi ha com a mínim dues grans comunitats, valons i flamencs, i això és algo comú aquí en Catalunya. El senyor Karel Velle és llicenciat en Història per la Universitat de Gant, treballa des de l'any 1989 als Arxius de l'Estat de Bèlgica, és professor també associat a la Universitat de Gant i també a Brussel·les, on imparteix coneixements sobre arxivística en el camp de la justícia, que és una de les seves especialitats. Va estudiar també arxivística a París, a Lovaina, a La Haia, i també com a historiador s'ha especialitzat en la història social de la medicina al seu país i, com comentava, en arxivística, concretament en els arxius judicials, que és una de les seves especialitats. Ha publicat diversos llibres, no cal dir que té un currículum molt extens que és impossible reproduir aquí mateix, però que publicacions que en alguns casos han estat reconegudes amb alguns premis. El senyor Karel Velle ens parlarà d'arxius, polítiques i ciutadans, l'impacte de la reforma de l'Estat a Bèlgica. S'il vous plaît.
Mr. President, dear members of the board, Mior colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to be in Barcelona, first of all, and I am honored to be invited by your association to talk about archives, politics and citizens. In my presentation today, I'll try to provide answers to the following questions. What is the meaning and the importance of archives for society? A lot has already been said this morning. Which are the characteristics of the Belgian archival landscape today? Thirdly, which is the political agenda concerning archives in Belgium? And last but not least, which impact do the reforms of the Belgian state since 1971 have on the archive sector in Belgium? First of all, the importance, the relevance of archives for society. Talking about the numerous relations between archives, politics and the citizen is not possible without first reminding the importance of archives for society. Archives are the written trace of human actions and processes that took place in a distant or more recent past. I would call them the administrative DNA of public authorities, families, businesses, private individuals. In nature, they are sources of information first used in operational management and for accountability and evidence, and only later as historical sources if they come into consideration as such after a selection procedure. The informative value recorded in archival documents, independently of their type of medium, form, or content, can't easily be underestimated. Information is crucial in operational management and for the proper functioning of the organization. Indeed, decisions are taken continuously on the basis of the available information. Today, reliable information must be made available rapidly. Business processes can run faster and more smoothly when documents are found more quickly. Organizations that are not capable of making reliable and authentic information in time and of giving account on the basis of the information they conserve are not credible, are not reliable. Thirdly, archives often have juridical evidentiary value. Documents are also preserved and managed to have the possibility to enforce rights, to show duties were fulfilled, to give account to politicians and citizens. I will only quote a few Belgian examples, Belgian and international examples. Due to the absence or incompleteness of archives, due to difficult access to archives and due to restrictions of the publicity of government documents, the scientific assessment of facts is sometimes not possible or only very difficult to realize and leads to a situation in which one has not come to terms with the past. The parliamentary inquiry committees into the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the first president of Congo in 1960, and the inquiry committee on the bankruptcy of the Sabena airline in 2003 concluded, among other things, that the accountability of particular individuals and the moral and political responsibility of one or the other public authority or manager could not be proved conclusively due to a lack of reliable documents or due to the incompleteness or improper conservation and accessibility of certain archives, among which a lot of cabinet archives. The conclusions and recommendations of the Lumumba Inquiry Committee, approved on the 21st of February 2002 by the House of Representatives, formed the basis, together with the report of the Inquiry Committee about the responsibility of the Belgian authorities in the persecution and deportation of Jews during the First World War, and the resulting resolution approved by the Senate in 2006, of a legislative proposal submitted to the Senate in 2007 and aimed at an amending of the archival law. This proposal was in turn the basis for the legal proposal approved in 2009. A second example of the importance of inventory value of archives bears on the so-called Enron scandal that was revealed in the United States in October 2001 and led to the bankruptcy of the Houston-based energy giant Enron Corporation and to the dissolution of Arthur Andersen, the world's fifth largest audit and accountancy partnership. The scandal made it obvious that the audit mechanisms in force did not work. One of the consequences of the scandal was the elaboration of new rules and legislation about recording, conserving, and reporting of financial information of public companies. The most famous law is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act that contributed to increasing the accountability of audit companies and the transparency of financial processes. And it also paved the way for the implementation of modern techniques with regard to digital archiving of financial information, not only in the United States, but even in Europe. A third example is the important role archives have played throughout the world and still play in the transition from authoritarian regimes to democratic models of society and in restoring human rights. Trudy gave us a lot of new examples of this morning. More precisely, it is the issue of preserving and making accessible the archives of secret police and security forces in countries such as the former German Democratic Republic, South Africa, Sudan, Chile, former Yugoslavia, Spain, and others. Excuse me. Doesn't work. No day goes by in which somewhere in the world researchers started to find historical evidence in archives in order to establish the historical truth or an objective analysis of the facts. Last year, it was decided to begin international research into the death of Dag Hammarskjöld, former Secretary General in the United States, who died in a plane crash in the night from 16 to 17 September 1961 on his way from Leopoldville to Nolda in Zambia. As indications of an attack as cause of the crash rose, the inquiry is now resumed. The Commission searched for archives in different countries, among which Belgium, that could help shed light on the circumstances of the crash and the death of Hammarskjöld. The Commission is particularly interested in the archives of Sabena, in the Union Minière enterprise, the archives of our National Security Office, the head of state, the archives of the Federal Public Service of Foreign Affairs, and so on. Another example is the inquiry into the murder of Julien Lahaut, president of the Communist Party of Belgium, on the 18th of August of 1950, just after the Second World War. The judicial inquiry never managed to elucidate the murder, and the case was closed in 1972 without further examination. In 2008, a resolution of the Senate requested the Belgian government to carry out scientific research into this death. The task was assigned to the Center for Historical Research and Documentation on War and Contemporary Society called CGS-SOMA. One last reason why we preserve archives is, of course, for historical reason, cultural importance, cultural value of the archives. Archives are our collective memory of society and allow future generations to reconstruct and understand the actions of protagonists within society by their public authorities, families, businesses, or private individuals. I would like to move now to the second part of my presentation. It's about the archival landscape and archival practice in Belgium. First of all, I would like to talk about the legal framework. Belgium is a small country with about 10.5 million inhabitants. Belgium is just as Germany, Switzerland, and Canada and Austria, a federal state, but with a number of special characteristics, indeed, and a high level of complexity. It's an understatement. Within the federal state Belgium, archives, conservation, and management is a competence exercised by both the federal authority and the regional authorities according to the rules in force that govern the devolution of powers. The archival law, stricto sensu, defines the scope of application and also rules about all aspects of archives management, from supervision, selection, destruction, transfer, publicity, and quality control. First of all, we have a federal law of 1955, which has been amended in 2009, like I said. And the main goals of these amendments were, I don't want to go into detail, improving or strengthening the execution of the missions of the state archives, first of all, supporting scientific research by reducing the retention period from 100 years to 30 years before an obligatory transfer of the archives to the depositories. Another goal was the promoting the publicity of government information, and finally, to ensure that transferred archives are made accessible more quickly according to the modalities stipulated by the king by a royal decree. Meanwhile, 3 regional parliaments have also adopted archival laws. The Walloon Parliament, thank you, the Walloon Parliament in 2001, the Brussels Parliament in 2009, and the Flemish Parliament on the 9th of July of 2010, 2 years ago. The corresponding executive decrees have not yet been published. The fact that Flanders has elaborated, I call Flanders because it's comparative with the situation here in your country, the fact that Flanders has elaborated, just as the other regions, rules for conservation and management of archives within the field of its authority is a good thing. The Flemish decree of 2010 about administrative archives management is furthermore of exceptional quality with regard to both content and legal technicality. The decree comprises a pertinent description of the field of application, defines the roles and responsibilities of different actors, those who are responsible for archives on the one hand and those who were managing the archives on the field on the other hand. And the law, the Flemish decree, establishes a number of criteria with which archives management must comply. It also has further stipulations about the support in archives management, organizing quality control, setting up selection commissions in charge of the elaboration and adopting of records, schedules, and the decree also regulates access to archives in a transparent and simple manner. A deliberate novelty is, for instance, Article 16, stipulating the creation of a central automized register of all public archives. However, The Association of the French-speaking Archivists of Belgium, on the one hand, and the former federal government on the other hand, were of the opinion that the Flemish government has breached its field of competence with regard to archives and violated a number of rules about the distribution of competences, which has meanwhile been confirmed by the Constitutional Court on 3 May last year. This judgment was, by the way, the first time that the highest court of Belgium pronounced a judgment on the distribution of competences between the federal state and the federated entities about archival matters. I will speak more in detail about the interpretation of this judgment and its impact on archive practice in Belgium later on. For the sake of completeness, it must be noted that a second procedure, namely before the Council of State, is still running. A judgment of this highest administrative court of Belgium is expected this year, probably before summer even. The Council must judge on annulment appeal that the Flemish government filed against the federal authorities regarding 2 executive decrees from 2010. The conflict bears on determining the period of time after which archives no longer rightfully have any administrative use, the famous 30 years rule, on the one hand, and on the other hand, on the competence of supervision of archives, the control of archives that are not yet filed at a public administration. As long, and that's my personal opinion, as long as the Conseil d'État, the Council of State, has not pronounced a judgment yet, it's absolutely impossible to finalize a cooperation agreement between the federal state and federal authorities and the Flemish authorities. In archival practice, a number of other rules, other regulations are applied in addition to the archival laws. And I mention rapidly the legislation on the publicity of the administration, which is also a legal framework on the European level. We have also, like a new country, probably legislation on the reuse of public sector information, on protection, of course, of privacy, and the legislation on copyright and related rights. And we have, and that's perhaps more specific for Belgium, we have a long list of specific regulations in force regarding access to certain types of documents, for instance, to the files of the criminal courts. When we will like to describe the archival landscape in Belgium, it seems reasonable to make a distinction between the public sector and the private sector. At the competence level of the federal authorities, the State Archives is the prime archives management and conservation institution for both archives from the public sector and the private sector. The State's Archives is one of the 10 federal scientific institutions of the Federal Science Policy Office, and one of the oldest ladies of the Belgian state, with its first archival legislation dating back to the French period, to a decree or a law from 1796, stipulating that archival documents of institutions and administrations that were suppressed had to be gathered in the main city of each département. It was only in late 1851 that the state archives in the provinces were placed under the authority of the national archivist, the Archiviste Général du Royaume. What's in the name? Today, the institution counts 19 archives repositories from Arlon in the south, French-speaking part, via the Royal Palace in Brussels, to Bruges in the northwest, in which over 270 kilometers of analog, mainly paper archives, and dozens of terabytes of digital and digitized records are conserved. The average annual increase of paper archives is still 10 kilometers. The archives of the federal parliament do not fall under the scope of the application of the archival law, but the archives of all federal agencies, including the Ministry of Defense and the Foreign Affairs Department, and including the federal scientific institutions like the archives of the big museums, the National Library, Royal Library, fall under the scope of the federal archival law. At the regional level, There are good working archive services, or at least archivists in charge of managing the semi-static and the historical archives. This is the case in the French community, the Walloon region, the Brussels capital region, and the Flemish government. Are you still following? I hope so. The most innovating work doubtlessly emanates from the so-called coordinating archive service of the Flemish authority. That is not only co-author of the decree of 2010, but also largely implied in numerous initiatives that prepare policies on change and knowledge management, digitization of business processes, dynamic office implementations. Little is known about the work of archive services of the other regional authorities. In my opinion, the management framework is rather weak, and to our knowledge, they have not published any annual reports. Professional support to archivists is mainly given by the French-speaking Professional Association and by the State's Archives. At the lower administrative levels, the officials responsible for archive management, that is to say the provincial clerk, the town of municipal secretaries or the secretaries of the public centers of social welfare, are usually assisted by at least one, perhaps several archivists. This is, for instance, the case in all Flemish provinces and in the province Walloon-Brabant, in all large or medium-sized cities in Flanders, Brussels, and Wallonia, although this last entity has some catching up to do. And finally, in all major public centers for social welfare that preserve a very rich and substantial archival heritage, which go sometimes back to the beginning of the Middle Ages. The second sector, of course, is the private sector. First of all, in Flanders. In the private sector, the number of protagonists, of actors, has highly increased, especially in Flanders. I mention rapidly the very active and very ambitious professional association like your association. It's called the VVBAD, with over 200 archivist members. I mentioned the Flemish Interface Center for Cultural Heritage, called FARO, which supports museums, libraries, and archival services in Flanders, providing professional support to the field of archives on behalf of the Agency for Arts and Heritage of the Ministry. And finally, the Archives Database of Flanders. It's a very well managed database of registered private archives in Flanders called Archiefbank Vlaanderen that systematically registers private sector archives preserved on the territory of the Flemish region. For the Flemish part, one can also mention provincial and regional networks, all of which are real and helpful associations for everyone active in the field of archives and interested in archival cooperation. And last but not least, there is FAAT. FAAT is the abbreviation of a forum for the alumni of the inter-university course in archival sciences. One major trump card for Flanders is the network of national private sector research and documentation centers, which are important repositories institutions and structurally financed within the framework of the Decree on Cultural Heritage. And finally, let me mention a number of expertise centers that are also subsidized by the Flemish government and make a useful contribution to the valorization of, for instance, architectural archives, musical archival heritage, and so on. The Flemish government also subsidizes 3 Dutch-speaking archives and institutions in Brussels. In the French-speaking part of the country, there are a dozen of private sector archives and documentation centers financed within the framework of a decree of 2004. They are very good related to the universities, the French-speaking universities in Brussels, in Liège, and in Louvain, and with the bilingual associations, and I translate, archives and libraries in Belgium, the Association of the French-speaking archivists, which I mentioned 2 minutes ago, created in November 2005, that issues a digital newspaper, and a second bilingual Belgian association that must not remain unmentioned is the Association pour la valorisation des archives d'entreprise, translated Association for the Promotion of Business Archives. And for the sake of the completeness, and we must mention also a German-speaking association for archivists, a very small one, with good contacts with the German-speaking part of Europe, Germany, Austria, Switzerland. It's called the Förderverein des Archivwesens in der deutschsprachigen Gemeinschaft Belgiens, a non-profit organization whose seat is in the State Archives in Eupen. Today, an estimated 500 or 600 professional archivists with academic education are active in Belgium, who manage more or less the same number of kilometers of archives. The very large majority of this critical mass works in the public sector and holds a degree in history. If we consider that each archivist is usually backed up by 2 to 3 administrative or technical collaborators, one can speak of a relatively small job market of circa 2,500 people, but this number may be underestimated. An important milestone in the process of professionalization of the archivist job in Flanders was the start of the inter-university course, Archival Sciences, Heritage and Modern Document Management, a postmaster degree set up at Flemish University in Brussels during the academic year 1989-19, with a total of 331 graduates until last year included. In the French-speaking part of the country, all universities have archival sciences and information management courses that either part of the history course or separate from it. But for now, there is no question of collaboration, let alone fusioning of courses. My conclusion, what the landscape and the archival sector in Belgium is concerned today, the archival practice and archival landscape are characterized by an increased attention from the side of the politicians, an increasing professionalization, a latent imbalance between the north and the south of the country, and an urgent need for structural discussions and cooperation. Political decision makers accord firstly more importance the last couple of years to the role and relevance of archives for society as instruments enabling more transparency and democratic control, and strengthening the relationship between the government and the citizens. And secondly, to the role of archive services and archival personnel. And this increased attention translates in extensive legislation and regulation, and in an increase in investment and all sorts of initiatives promoting the support and professionalization of the sector, at least on the federal level and in Flanders. And in this context, it must be mentioned that the biggest catching up process of the past years took place in Flanders, in the Flemish region, although this development also brings about a series of disadvantages, a sharp increase in rules, audit and control mechanisms, creating bureaucracy, the multitude of different protagonists, which leads to a fragmentation of the field of work and to obstructive competition, and which does not help to create a coherent and streamlined representation of interests. All of these protagonists have their own speciality, expertise, ambitions, agenda, network, clientele, and one thing in common, which is that they mostly fish in the same waters of public funding. The increasing professionalization of the sector takes place thanks to investments in specialized education and continuing education organized by support points and professional associations, networks, and of course by the state archives. Despite countless efforts, a latent imbalance remains between the initiatives at federal and Flemish level on one hand, and those of the other regional entities with regard to the number of activities and investments, their impacts and their visibility. And there is an urgent need for structural cooperation in all areas of archival practice, ranging from selection of archives, from registration to description and digitization. Let's go to the third part, small part of my presentation. I would like to talk about archives and the political agenda in Belgium but in an international perspective. We all know that there are a lot of issues in our archival business which are, politically spoken, neutral. They are related to the material, technical, and juridical aspects of archives and information management. The list is, of course, very long, but I give some examples. The material management of archives, the prevention of disasters, the protection of archives, including electronic data, which is linked to a very topical issue nowadays, namely cyber security strategies, the protection of archives against theft, and the implementation of an anti-theft policy for the archival sector. The list is very long. Neutral issues. But I would like to underline that not all issues under discussion in the archival sector are neutral from the political point of view, because their treatment can sometimes be linked to administrative and legal traditions, political choices, moral standards, and even ideologies. Sometimes the archives policy is also part of a larger, we heard it from Trudy this morning, from a larger, and also from Jens, socio-economic, geopolitical, and administrative and political context of countries and regions. I'll give some small examples of burning issues. First one has to bear in mind the partition of competences between national states and regions, or between the different administrative layers. All over the world, and it's not typically for Belgium, not typically for Spain, but all over the world, reforms of the state and the administration have an impact on the conservation and the management of archives. As for Belgium, let me refer to the consequences of the far-reaching operations such as the merger of the municipalities in the 1970s in Belgium, the splitting up of the province of Brabant in the course of the fourth state reform in 1995, and another example, the transfer of a lot of competences to the regions, from the federal state to the regions, which sometimes has led to chaos and loss of archives. Another sensitive issue in Belgium that is rarely neutral involves the appraisal of public archives and the criteria therefore. How is today's history being documented for future generations? Which information will be eliminated and which will be kept for the further generations, and who is deciding? It's a hot issue also on the international level. A third theme that is occasionally feeding fierce discussions concerns the use and the reuse of archives under copyright. The interests of the European and national copyright associations and lobby groups are not the same as those of the managers and keepers of cultural heritage collections, or not necessarily. A fourth issue, which continues to be very topical, is access to secret information, to information concerning the security and the economic interests of the state, to information which has been gathered, sorted, and circulated by secret services. I won't go into detail. I hope to give some anecdotes and details in the article. And the fifth example, and Jens mentioned it this morning, of a politically sensitive issue concerning archives is the restitution of archives between independent states. Much has already been written about the problems of the so-called displaced archives and the restitutions of archival heritage that has ended in another country due to wars, or that was dredged off by colonial powers and afterwards claimed by the countries or communities concerned. There are still a lot to do in this field. There are several files who are still problematic, but there are, however, also cases that get solved. For instance, the well-documented restitution in 2002 of the Belgian archives that had been looted by the Germans from Russian repositories in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And on the 16th of April of this year, the Landesarchiv Nordrhein-Westfalen in Düsseldorf has restituted to the Belgian state an important archival collection which was stolen by the Germans and put into depositories in the north of the country. And still this year, the State Archives of Belgium will restitute on behalf of the state the recently discovered, inventoried, and partially digitized archives of the German embassy in Brussels during the Second World War. Which are the political sensitive and archive-related issues in Belgium? or in other words, which problems have to be urgently solved by politics or by politicians. I will be very brief. At institutional level, the federal state and the regions share the competences with regard to the care for and the management of archives and the practical implementation of the respective legislations on archives. In my opinion, this question can be approached in two possible ways, namely through cooperation and management agreements on the one hand, which we are preparing nowadays, and the necessary updating or amending of the respective laws and decrees on the other hand. The first cooperation agreement that is worth mentioning is the one reached in April 2013 between the State Archives and the Ministry of the German-speaking community after intense discussions between the Secretary-General of the Ministry and myself. In the context of the juridical problems concerning the application of the legislation on archives, different visions of the role of archives are also playing an important role. On the one hand, archives and archive services involved in cultural heritage, which is a competence of the communities, the Flemish, the French-speaking and the German-speaking community on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the vision to archives as source of historical information and archival services as the meeting point of the digital public service and the centers of historical knowledge, what a common interest is, a shared competence on the national and the federal level. At the federal level, I noticed several difficulties that politics and politicians should solve. 2 years ago, the policymakers of the Defense and Foreign Affairs Department asked for an amendment of the executive decree of the archival law. This discussion is still going on, and I hope that it will be solved at the end of the year. In the Department of Justice, there are a lot of problems, but there are at least 3 problems which need to be solved in short term. They are related to the accessibility and the access to the archives of the court-martial of the post-war period. We are talking about 12 kilometers archives. Another problem is the appraisal and the transfer of the archives of the security service, older than 30 years. I save you the details of all these files and will be focused today on the archives of the Belgian State Security Service. Until now, the Director General, let's say, of the Belgian State Security Service refused to open the archives older than 30 years for historical research, except for some individuals to whom access was granted on a legal basis. There has been a lot of parliamentary questions recently. We hope that will be solved also this year, at least before the elections of next year. Another question still remains since decades is the status of the Cabinet and Secretary archives. The synthesis of this question is, what's the status? Is it a public archives or is it private archives? And I think that this problem should be solved within the updating of a new archival law. A fourth matter involves the application of the legislation on archives in general. What's the problem? We don't have a good implementation or applicable archival law without enforcement and without budget. We can apply legislation on 2 conditions. When there is a political will to force them in the application, and secondly, when there is a budget to implement and to execute it. The reform of Belgium since 1971 and the archives. That's my last point. The notion of reform of the Belgian state usually refers to the process of successive modifications of the constitution that reshaped the unitary Belgium of 1830 into a federal state with 3 regions and 3 communities, each with their own competences. State reforms take place in several phases. In 1970, 1980, 1988, we are now at the 6th state reform of Belgium, during which always a package of competences is transferred from the national level, from the national state, to the regional entities. All the educational and cultural competences have been transferred to the Flemish, French-speaking, and German-speaking communities. For a good understanding of the consequences of this state reform, one should keep in mind some new concepts and some new legislation and its implementation. The Archival Law of 1955 and its implementation decree of 1957 came into being in the context of the unitary Belgian state, and they do not mention any regulation about the possible cultural function of archive service, nor about the cultural value of archives. As a result of the state reform, archives have gradually gotten considered as cultural goods and later as cultural heritage. The communities have a specific competence regarding cultural archives based on their cultural heritage competences. I won't give you all the details about the Flemish legislation since 1985. I will publish it in the article if the association is interested. But we keep in mind that there has a huge, very active initiative, legislative initiative since the 80s of the 80s and the 90s in Flanders to promote, to finance the cultural heritage sector within the Flemish region and, of course, also the archival sector. In the course of the state reform, devolution to the regional authorities not only bore on the competences pertaining to culture, but also on those regarding education and the organization of the provinces and local authorities. The competences of the communities were extended in the course of the state reform of 1988-1989 to all levels of education, with a few exceptions only. As a consequence, the Flemish, French, and German-speaking communities were from this moment responsible for organizing the education of archivists and archive personnel. The Flemish community and the French community have taken initiatives in this regard, setting up profiles of the profession and education programs. The so-called fifth state reform of 2001-2003 transferred the responsibility of the administrative supervision of subordinated authorities, that is to say the provinces, municipalities, church councils, to the regions. This devolution of powers had far-reaching consequences for archival practice. Firstly, a movement emerged, especially in Flanders, that would lead to the creation of a legal framework for public sector archive management. And the positions of the proponents of a Flemish decree on public archives can be resumed as follows, and it's very simple. What is the raisonnement? As the Flemish authorities are exclusively in charge of their subordinated local authorities, it is only logical that the Flemish authorities are also competent for elaborating a regulation for archives created or conserved by these local authorities. And as I said before, the Flemish decree about administrative archives management of 9 July 2010 has led to a conflict of competence with the federal authority that was settled by the Constitutional Court. I don't want to go in detail, I don't have the time to go in detail on the interpretation of the judgment of the Constitutional Court, but let's say briefly that the Constitutional Court invalidated a number of provisions of the Flemish decree and largely confirmed a certain number of competences of the federal state. The Flemish region is still and will still be competent for selection, management of their own archives, but when they are older than 30 years, when they should be transferred, it are the federal state and the national archivist which can give directives and regulations. There's one point I would like to mention. It bears on the competence for appraisal and destruction and giving archives a new destination. The Flemish decree stipulates the creation of appraisal committees per administrative level. These committees are in charge of drawing up records, schedules to be approved and be published by the Flemish government. The Flemish authority argued in front of the court that the appraisal committees could remain in existence after the judgment, but that they cannot decide the final destination of the archives of municipalities, provinces, certain municipal and provincial institutions, and so on. This remains the exclusive competence of the National Archivist, who shall and should have discussions later on this year with the Flemish authority in the exercise of his or her appraisal competence. My conclusion: the impact, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, of the reform of the Belgian institutions on the functioning of archive services should not be underestimated, but also not overestimated. The transfer of competences to the federal entities, communities and regions in Belgium largely determines the differences in which archives are acquired, managed and made accessible. The transfer of cultural affairs and the reinforcement of the cultural autonomy of the communities have generated a difference in archival practice between the North, Flanders, and the South, the Walloon part of the country. In Flanders, much more resources are dedicated to material preservation and juridical protection of cultural goods and management of the institution to a fully integrated cultural heritage policy, whereas it was focused until then on the traditional keepers of cultural heritage, namely the museums and the archival services. It is this integration that aimed, among others, at enhancing the correlation between cultural heritage and public services, at reinforcing the role of public authorities in cultural heritage policy, at drawing a clear definition of the function of the different protagonists, and at raising more attention for all cultural goods, including, for instance, audiovisual and digital documents. It is this integrated approach of the Flemish authority included a simplification of the procedures, the elimination of hiatuses and overlaps in the support and subsidization of policy, and the concentration of public service expertise in one single contact point, but also the promotion of collaboration between cultural heritage institutions in order to enhance the international visibility of the collections, and the approach linked subsidization to the development of a policy vision as stipulated in the management plans. The transfer of the educational competences did not have a major impact on archival practice, even if the Flemish authority has defined professional profiles for several functions in the archival business. The programs of the academic curricula of both communities are not so much different. All courses contain a series of theoretical courses as well as internships and exercises. The differences in the fields of application of the three archives decrees, Flanders, Brussels, Wallonia, show at least that dissimilar visions of public archive sector exist. Whereas the Flemish authority has the ambition to cover the entire archives activities and to exercise its competences in the largest possible manner, the Brussels and the Walloon authorities are for the moment concentrating on their own administrations and public institutions. And for the archives supervision, control of the local authorities, the local administration, they keep relying on the efforts of the federal state archives. The evolution of further archival practice in the years to come will depend on several elements. First of all, there is the modernization, like I said, of the archival law. The federal law, as well as the Brussels and Walloon decrees, need to be further amended. The Parliament of the French community has still not voted an archives decree. The German-speaking community has chosen not to vote an archives decree and has opted for a collaboration agreement between its ministry and the state archives, which has been signed recently in April. Secondly, the further institutional evolution of the archive sector largely depends on the implementation of the different archival laws. 2 implementation decrees of the federal archival law are currently subject to cancellation procedure initiated by the Flemish authority before the Council of State. The judgment on this matter is due for this summer this year. The implementation decree of the Flemish Archives decree is ready, but has not been published yet. The other decrees, the Brussels and the Walloon ones, still have no corresponding implementation decree. And thirdly, finally, formal collaboration agreements will have to be elaborated in the coming months, mainly between the federal and the Flemish authorities. But the impact of the state reform on archival practice should also not be overestimated. Even if the institutional and legislative framework are different, all aspects of archive management are in fact, all is much said, but a lot of archive management are in fact determined by international norms and standards. The Code of Ethics, the Principles of Access to Archives of Trudy 2012, of the International Council on Archives, the Journal International Standard Archival Description, ISAG, the Encoded Archival Description, the XML standard for encoding archival finding aids, are of course also applied in Belgium, at least I hope so. The Belgian authorities too have to abide by the European rules concerning privacy, data protection, reuse of information and data protection. So there has been a change, there has been a reform in Belgium with an impact on the archival business, but we don't have to overestimate. Thank you so much.